Welcome to Caffeinate and Advocate. I'm Jess, your host who probably doesn't need any more coffee, joined today by Tyler, who, if you follow us on social media, you may recognize as one of our recurring faces that we like to showcase. So Tyler is a regional director with PeerStar and also an immense advocate for mental health and substance use recovery. So talking to Tyler, we talked a little bit before we met today, and I asked you what you're really passionate about advocating for, or kind of what you feel like is something we need to continue to advocate for. And you mentioned that one of your passions is trauma awareness. So something we talked about is that that's a very general topic. So when you think of people that maybe don't understand trauma or need to learn about it, what are some of the things you like to focus on when you are spreading awareness of trauma?
I think one of the big things that I wish we could, spread more awareness and knowledge about is what it looks like to have trauma responses or reactions to trauma. They can happen years after a traumatic experience or event, and it looks so different for so many people. And I think it's something that is misunderstood. And so people don't necessarily understand it, like the big unrealistic or unreasonable reactions to, small things, overstimulation, anger, aggression, being withdrawn or dissociated, can come off as all of these different things that are just not being understood as a post-traumatic stress disorder or a response to a traumatic event. And I think that we downplay also what should qualify, somebody having that traumatic response too.
I like that you pointed out post-traumatic stress disorder and trauma responses, because for a lot of people who don't understand what trauma is, maybe we'll kind of start from the beginning of what a trauma is. But I think something that is very important is there are different things. Someone can have post-traumatic stress disorder, meaning that they have symptoms that qualify them for that disorder, and that it is impacting an aspect of their life and they don't want it to. Or somebody, and what is very common is for people to have traumatic stress, meaning they've experienced something that has caused their body and their brain to respond and develop patterns of those responses. So kind of my question, is I think like you mentioned, there is some confusion about what is trauma, because what's trauma to me is not trauma to you, or vice versa. We can experience the same event and one of us could find it traumatic and one of us could bounce back and just think it was a hiccup in my day. So how do you explain to people what a trauma or a traumatic event or a traumatic experience is?
So I think that, like the diagnostic criteria really lays out what is a qualifying traumatic event for a PTSD diagnosis. But like you said, there's so many factors in that. There's pre-existing conditions, pre-existing experiences that make somebody more susceptible to developing a stress disorder. If the traumatic event isn't something that is recognized as a traumatic event, then those other stress disorders can come up. And I think that's something else that the general public or even some mental health professionals don't realize is there's more than one stress disorder. It doesn't all just fit into one cluster, and it doesn't all just manifest the same way. But I think that the best way to describe a traumatic event is something that is just unnatural. And I think that our society has started to, kind of make unnatural events more comfortable. We don't always realize something as being an unnatural or a traumatic experience because it's just become a part of our culture sometimes. And so, I think it's just anything unnatural.
And, I've heard it explained as well as it's an unnatural, something unexpected is, an experience, something unexpected that overwhelms our ability to cope.
Yes.
And I think that's a big part of it because we have different levels of resiliency. We have different support systems as individuals. We have different experiences and different coping mechanisms. So I think that is a big part is not everyone has the same ability to cope. And so when something overwhelms your ability to cope, that's going to look different for all of us.
And I think that there's those external abilities to cope. So there's the support systems, there's, the coping skills, there's the lifestyle choices. But then we also have to realize that stress is a physical reaction. And so, is our body regulated and working the way that it should be? Our hormones being released and controlled the way that they should be so that the body isn't overwhelmed or neglected when it comes to having certain, endorphins and hormones, going all throughout our body. So we can do all of the stuff on the outside too, but we have to understand that it's an inside job also. Trauma is one of those very like all-encompassing, holistic, invaders basically.
You gave some examples of some trauma responses, and working in human services and working in peer support, I know both of us have spent a lot of our career supporting other people. And when we were talking before, you had shared some very specific trauma responses that working in human services sometimes we see, but as you mentioned, maybe some professionals don't recognize them as trauma responses. A lot of family members and friends and coworkers might not recognize some of the behaviors or experiences of the people they're surrounded by as a trauma response. Do you mind sharing just some of those examples again of maybe what you have noticed could be possibly a trauma response, and not just, I think you had said, not just a defiant behavior or not just a bad attitude?
Yeah, I think that a lot of, working in this field in peer support, I think that we see a lot of individuals that, come off very guarded. So they may, be aggressive or angry. They may, look on the outside as being like hostile or defiant or difficult. But that could just be like their body being overstimulated and overwhelmed, and it just comes out as aggression or as like a survival mechanism that they have adapted to keep themselves safe and feeling safe. Because, anger feels safer than vulnerability sometimes for some individuals when it comes to trauma.
It almost feels like it's protecting you.
Exactly. Yeah, like it's a survival mechanism. So we perceive it as an area of improvement, whereas they see that as no, this is what's keeping me safe. Or we see a lot of individuals just become withdrawn. They're very hard to hold a conversation with. They are there, but they're not paying attention. Maybe they're kind of like dissociated. That again can be a trauma response and another survival mechanism. So, and then the big reactions. We were talking about like a spilled cup of water. For most people, it's like, okay, I'll just go grab a rag and I'll clean it up. But if somebody's in that heightened state and they're already susceptible to a trauma response, or they're already kind of on edge, then that spilled cup of water can be a really big deal. So those big reactions to things that don't seem warranted almost. And I think that, people who are uneducated when it comes to what the root of those things are, it can look like so many different things.
I think one of the best parts about working in peer support is, although a lot of us that work in it do have that clinical education and experience, but I love working in peer support that we try to not use clinical terms. We try to not use the textbook information, because we want everyone to be able to understand what we're talking about. And kind of my last kind of focus here is knowing what a traumatic experience can be, knowing what a traumatic response is the first step, but the main step is how do we help? And I think in peer support, I've heard in memes. I love social media memes most times, not always, but I've seen things pass around social media that you'll hear someone say that they had a mind frame switch when supporting a family member, a friend, or working with somebody that had maybe something that could have been a trauma response. That instead of saying what's wrong with you, they now tell themselves what happened to you. And it's their way of kind of a non-clinical way of saying, oh, I'm recognizing that the way this person's acting could mean so much more. And so my question kind of to you is, what do we tell people who aren't trauma informed, who aren't aware of this? How do you support somebody who's maybe having some of these traumatic stress responses?
I heard in a training once to stay curious. Like, you know, if we're in peer support, stay curious about your peer. If it's a family member or a loved one, stay curious, because then you're going to be looking for the, you know, what happened as opposed to what's wrong with you. You know, and trying to understand, like, where is this coming from? You know, helping them follow the breadcrumb trail back to what could have been, you know, the thing that came in and planted that seed to eventually lead to this trauma response. Because sometimes it can be days building. That, you know, something can happen that, you know, is like re-triggering, re-traumatizing, you know, brings in those feelings of remembrance of, you know, a situation that used to not feel safe or was unnatural. And then it just builds and builds and builds, and then it comes out. So, you know, help them pick up the breadcrumbs, help them, you know, figure out where this is coming from, you know, get in tune with the body, like figure out, like, what is your body trying to teach you right now? What is, you know, it saying is not okay? And just supporting them through that process, but staying curious.
I think that is great for not only the people supporting someone to hear, but also maybe the person who's experiencing the traumatic stress responses, because I think one of the key factors in healing and moving forward is gaining control. Because we just said it's a situation that is unnatural, it's kind of out of your control, it overwhelms your ability to cope, and gaining control and finding trust and safety. And so I know there's been a big push for, you know, survivors of trauma to be responsible for their triggers. And I think what that means is finding out what their body is telling them, finding out what in their world is making them feel that way, and learning how to take power and control over those things. And if you have a support system that can help with that, that's even better. Well, we could talk about this forever. Tyler and I said we're going to make this like a 4-part series. So, we say that, but that's all with good intentions. So before we go, last thing, we have to do a coffee can question. And every time I sing it like that, I feel a little more self-conscious about it. So Tyler, pick a question. Pick a question before we end here.
Okay. What do you wish people knew about mental health? I wish people knew or understand that everybody has mental health. It's just a matter of, is it well, or is it, you know, something that needs a little attention?
I love that. I will agree. I won't even have something different. Like you said, everyone, we all have physical health to take care of, and we all have mental health to take care of.
Yep.
So just because someone uses the term mental health, it doesn't necessarily mean that their health is struggling. It can mean that their health is well at that time. So I think that's great. But Tyler, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having
on this
me.
lovely day. Thank you for coordinating our outfits.
I know, yeah,
without
we didn't
even talking before.
Nope.
So until the next time, thanks for caffeinating and advocating. I like to do a toast.